Okay, in this session, we're going to talk about ways of replacing an expensive textbook with alternatives. Specifically, we'll be focusing on OER, Waymaker, and the OI options that are available. One of the basic problems that this can be helpful in addressing is that while the rate of return to a college degree is at the highest level we've ever recorded, and it also explains most of the growth in US income inequality. Those people who have college degrees are doing extremely well. Those people without them are doing much worse than at any time before. The growth in the rate of return to education has both increased the earnings of college graduates, but also led to a reduction, not just relatively, but also in absolute terms for those who do not have higher levels of education. 60% of continuing generation college students graduate within 5 years of starting college, but less than 45% of first-gen students do. So there's a pretty big gap in the achievement of individuals from households where one or more parents had a college degree and those where they did not. 90% of low-income first-gen students don't graduate within 6 years of starting college. And that's an outcome that is rather disgraceful in a country as wealthy as ours. Part of the reason, there's many reasons for this, but part of the reasons is some of the inequality that some of the inequality has impact on student success within college. And in general, this is one of the reasons why we have the lowest rate of intergenerational mobility, the ability to move from one income bracket to another or from one income quintile to another across a generation. So basically, if you were born into a household that's in the bottom quintile, then your children are very likely to be in the lowest quintile. And this is the lowest level we've seen in the US, as well as, again, one of the worst that we've seen of pretty much any country out there, certainly any industrialized countries. And this is especially true for individuals who are Black or Hispanic. Now, there's many reasons for this, but in terms of education, one of the reasons is inequality in access to basic educational resource. The cost of textbooks for many years had been rising at significantly faster than the rate of inflation. That's only slowed in the last 3 or 4 years, in large part because of the growth of OER and other alternatives that have forced publishers to keep prices somewhat lower than they had been. In particular, between 1977 and 2015, the rate of increase in textbook prices was 3 times the rate of inflation. Again, this has leveled off because of the growth of OER adoptions. Oswego and most other four-year colleges in SUNY and outside of SUNY have seen relatively low rates of adoption of OER. It's been much more popular and it's been much more widely adopted at community colleges. Now, one of the problems that our students come in with is that they come in with very unequal backgrounds in terms of prior education. And much of that is because the US is one of a few industrialized countries in which the financing of schools is tied to the wealth of households in the community. And because of that, school districts where there's a large proportion of low-income households tend to have the least resources. Even though states and the federal government make some adjustments for this, we see very large disparities in terms of the resources that are provided to students in schools, depending on the income of the school district in which they reside. So students who come from low-income households are much more likely to go to schools that have far fewer resources, where the teachers are paid less, where the textbooks may be outdated, where they don't have as much educational technology, where there's generally less professional development for teachers, and so on. That leads to fairly large differences in the prior knowledge that our students enter colleges with. And certainly the pandemic has made these disparities dramatically larger. So there's many things that can be done to address this, but in this session, we're just going to talk about how perhaps we might be able to use OER and adaptive and personalized learning systems to help reduce some of these disparities. And one advantage of using free textbooks in whatever form they are is that it provides all students with either free or, in the worst case, low cost first day access. There are some of the systems we'll talk about may have a cost, but most of the resources we'll be talking about are free to students, because if you're a participant in the SUNY system, you have access to all the materials from Waymaker and OLI, as well as any free OER software that's available. And this reduces the inequality of access, because wealthier students or students from wealthier households were always able to buy the textbooks at the start of the semester. Students who were struggling to pay bills often postponed the textbook. And I think anyone who's been teaching for any length of time will know of cases where students often would not have the basic textbook that you were expecting them to be using 2, 3, 4, or more weeks into the semester. Or sometimes they don't buy textbooks at all, or they share textbooks or try to borrow them from libraries and so on, where access is limited. One solution that we can use is inclusive access, as it's called here at Oswego. And with inclusive access, basically, you're getting a discounted textbook where it's added to the student's bill. So it's available to all students on the first day. This is still, it still adds a cost to students, but at least it provides equitable access. OER is free and also is available on the first day. And a suggestion that I'd have is that if available, you consider using not just the OER textbook, but OER that includes an adaptive or personalized learning component. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the session. There's a lot of places where you can find OER. One is SUNY OER Services has a lot of resources available. And I just clicked on that by mistake. So SUNY OER Services. At SUNY Geneseo, let me make this a little bit larger. At SUNY Geneseo, there's the OASIS website, which has a search tool that will let you search for OER materials. OpenStax is one of the largest sources of OER textbooks. It's provided through Rice University. The Open Textbook Library at the University of Minnesota also contains many free textbooks. BC Open Ed, British Columbia, has open textbooks. The University of Georgia has resources from the Global Textbook Project. And there's also a whole series of books that have been created as wiki projects with collaborations among many researchers, and some have involved student-created work as well. There's also Project Gutenberg if you're working with texts that have moved into the public domain. So if you're teaching classes in early American literature, or classes in the history of thought or history of philosophy, or anything that uses older original resources or primary resources, Project Gutenberg has a phenomenal array of classic textbooks and resources. The American Institute of Mathematics also has some open math texts available. Now, though, I would like to talk just a little bit about adaptive learning techniques, because many colleges have moved into a system where they've had fairly large scale adoption of adaptive learning, and there's some really good reasons for this. The way an adaptive learning package typically works is a course is, as usual, divided into a number of different course modules. And it starts generally by students taking a pretest at the beginning of the course module, which assesses what students have learned, what students come into the course knowing. And then it creates a customized learning path, which is based on the results of that pretest. And once this path is determined for the student, it will contain the content, the basic components from the textbook that students need to read, formative assessments that help students develop their understanding and practice the concepts as they're working through the material, and also summative assessments after they've concluded that will provide them with feedback and provide the instructor with feedback on how well the student has mastered the material. But as part of this, the formative assessments also provide additional resources as needed for students when when there is some area that they need additional work on. If they're able to work through problems on the first pass, it will generally move them past that to the next set of topics. And an advantage of the use of adaptive learning as a basic textbook, as something that students would generally be doing outside of the class, is it allows students to focus their time on the areas where they benefit the most from using their time, so that they're not spending an equal amount of time on all aspects of the material that they're supposed to learn. They'll focus their efforts on the things that they most need to focus their efforts on. And one concept here is that it allows students basically to address any of the inequalities that they've experienced in the prior educational experiences, so that basically students are given the resources they need to be successful. And the advantage of this is that, again, if students come in knowing some things really well and not knowing anything at all about other topics, they're going to be using the time in the most efficient way possible to achieve that mastery. And many of these adaptive learning packages are based on some sort of an artificial intelligence engine. And basically, they become better at this as they acquire more data from the learning processes of students who are using them. And one of the things that Flower Darby has noted, actually, in a talk that she gave to SUNY a couple of years back, is that Flower Darby, she suggested that really these adaptive learning packages are designed for the students in the back of the room, the students who are not as fully engaged because they don't quite get the material as well as the students who are anxiously, who are very strongly participating, actively participating in classes. And it basically provides a way of equalizing backgrounds in ways that traditional lecture classes generally would not, because if we use a lecture approach to teaching materials, it's essentially using a one-size-fits-all approach, so that everyone is expected to march through the course in the same way, in the same process, with the same, with the same needs. And that does not characterize our students very well. And this is a way where students who don't come in with as much knowledge will have to do more work, but it provides them the opportunity for that work to allow them to be more successful. Now, something very similar to adaptive learning is a personalized learning system, as it's called by Lumen Learning with their Waymaker package. And it's a similar structure, but it doesn't rely on the same artificial intelligence engine. Once again, at the beginning of each course module, students will complete a pretest. Then they're given guidance on what material they've mastered and what they haven't by using a color code system. The course, each module of the course is divided up into a series of boxes on the screen, or little frames that break the content up into little submodules. And once they pass it, the color changes to indicate that they've mastered that material, and then they move on to the next module. So it's not guiding students in the same way. Instead, it's encouraging students to use the feedback they're getting from their success working through the module to advance and work on the things that they need to work on more on their own. So it's personalized, but it also allows students to have unlimited practice, that they can keep going through the material until they've mastered it, where they're given different questions, they're given different resources and different practice problems to allow them to master the material as many times as they need to before they've reached that level of success. And then again, at the end of each module, there's a summative assessment that provides 2 attempts. And automated within the system is an option that instructors can set up. And I think most people who use a Waymaker package do this, that there's automated emails that appear to come from the instructor. Well, they do come from the instructor, where you configure them, and there's just some variation in those. So they're not all the same. So students will get emails with somewhat different structures, which will tell students what perhaps they need to do to be successful. And in particular, it will tell them that they've attempted that summative assessment at the end without having mastered some of the material. It tells them which material they need to go back and review, and strongly encourages students to go back and review that materials before attempting their second attempt at that. And when students are doing poorly, it gives the instructors some pre-configured emails that can be sent, encouraging the students to meet with them to address some of the concerns or some of the problems they're having with the course. So it makes it easier to get feedback to students at scale when you're using, especially if you're teaching a fairly large class. Now, in terms of the OLI, OLI is provided by a series of adaptive learning packages developed by Carnegie Mellon, the Open Learning Initiative. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of that. But OLI, I think it is the Open Learning Initiative. It was a group that developed adaptive learning programs at Carnegie Mellon, and Waymaker is available through Lumen Learning. And for people in the SUNY system, both the adaptive learning systems from OLI and the personalized learning system for Waymaker are free for people from the SUNY system, at least for the next few years. I'm assuming that SUNY is likely to continue the contract with Lumen Learning Waymaker, which arranges for both of these to be provided. But if you're not part of the SUNY system, or if at some point in the future you're watching this and that contract has expired, then the cost to a student of this whole package, including the built-in textbook, is $25 per student, which is far less than most textbooks. The material is generally of very high quality. I can vouch particularly for the Waymaker package, which I've been using for about 4 years now. It's something which is reviewed every semester, that basically they look at what areas students are doing poorly. They collect data from any student who's willing to share the results to help improve the system. And they find the areas where students have spent a lot of time, but have not been as successful in the assessment. And they go back and they review. First, they make sure the assessments are really measuring what they'd like it to measure, and then they check to see what other material they could provide to help students reach the level of attainment that the designers of the package hope students would achieve. And it is revised on a regular basis, and there's a lot of people using a system, and there's a lot of students using it. So they're getting some really good feedback on what's working and what's not working, and they use that to improve the system, actually on a every 6 months or so, and at a higher level, a little bit less frequently. But it's based on some really good OER content, which is available at OpenStax and Economics, and much of it relies on material from that. In creating these packages, a backwards design process was used, where they start with a set of learning objectives that were developed by teams of faculty in the disciplines, and then they build the learning materials that are very closely aligned to those learning objectives. And they make the design of these systems, make the connection, the alignment between the content, the learning activities, and the learning objectives really transparent to students. So they always know what the learning objectives are for the module, and what learning objectives are working to master. And I already mentioned the continuous improvement. There's some really good features in the design of the Waymaker package, and I'm assuming this is true with the OLI materials as well, or is similar with the OLI material. Each of the Waymaker modules open with a section on why this material matters, to help motivate us, to help build some intrinsic motivation, and then ask students to show what they know, basically to do that pre-assessment that provides information on where students need to work the most. Then in the content, it's not just the OER text. There's embedded interactive elements where students, in the case of economics, get to shift curves around, solve problems, and so forth. And there's some really high quality videos embedded. Some of them are from Crash Course, some of them are from Khan Academy, and some are from a variety of other people out there who produce some really good economic videos. And it's also designed to help students improve their metacognition. And built into the design is this retrieval is continuous retrieval practice, that students are using a method of practicing material by, once they learn a new concept, they get to think about it and try to apply it with some realistic and interesting problems. When I've used Waymaker, one of the things that really surprised me is, even though in a class of 300 or 400 students, I had told students that they'd be getting messages from me that were generated by the package automatically, I would often get responses to that. The first few weeks of the class, I'd often get 40, 50, or 60 responses in a week to the messages encouraging students to focus their efforts a little bit more. Sometimes the students would apologize for not devoting enough time. Sometimes they'd write and say, thank you for this. Or some of the feedback is to praise students when they do really well and to congratulate them on the success of their efforts on the material. And I was amazed at how often students would respond to the automated messaging. And it did seem to create more sense of my presence in the class, both in an online class and in a face-to-face class, when they were working alone on their computers in the evening or outside of class time. And it did lead, in part because of that communication, with more frequent communication in general through emails, as well as, before the pandemic, students just stopping by my office to talk about how they were doing in ways that normally wouldn't happen until after midterm grades started to appear. I've been really impressed by the quality of the content and also the quality of the embedded questions in there. There have been lots of studies that have assessed the impact of personalized and adaptive learning systems. In many studies, they found significant increases in student learning. But what's perhaps even more important is, while these approaches tend to benefit all students, the benefits tend to be the largest for students that are first-gen students and low-income students, as well as students from minoritized groups. So the benefits, essentially, it closes some of those gaps that we tend to observe in performance based on first or continuing generation status, based on income, and based on race. And that's perhaps the main reason to consider using these resources. And they also tend to result in higher student retention and persistence. In many studies that have been done, particularly in institutions that have adopted adaptive or personalized learning systems across many of their courses. If you choose to adopt these, if you choose to adopt, say, the Waymaker package, I would encourage you to use the messaging tool and to respond quickly to student responses to that. I would recommend, though, that if you're going to use the quizzes that come with the Waymaker package for grades, or similarly perhaps with OLI, you should be aware that pretty much all of them will end up on the various academic dishonesty sites really, really quickly. So students do have the option of just looking up this material, which weakens the impact of this. So you probably should keep any of these quizzes very low stakes, give students some incentive to do them, but you probably shouldn't take the grades too seriously as a measure of overall achievement, because it is possible for students to essentially bypass much of that quizzing. And I would suggest using some other method of assessment so that you have a little bit more of security. Basically, use your own, create your own assessments and use those for a larger share of the grades. But the practice quizzes, especially if students know they don't affect their grades very much, or the weekly quizzes, if they know they have a fairly small impact on the grades, but their ability to perform well on that is a good predictor of how well they would do on the assignments that you create or the assessment you create. It gives students much more of an incentive to actually work on them themselves, rather than relying on Chegg or any of the other academic dishonesty sites available online. Such as Course Hero, Study Blue, and others. One concern with the use of adaptive and personalized learning systems is essentially each student, when they're working with us, is working alone. It doesn't provide a sense of class community in the same way as group projects and other things may do. And therefore, you may want to think about ways of building that in. Now, there's many places you can find adaptive and personalized learning platforms. There's a link here to the site for SUNY, which is available right here at oer.suny.edu. There we go. And this lists all the courses that are available and as packages. And there's a pretty long list. So I would encourage you, especially if you're in SUNY, you look at this. But if you're outside of it, certainly it's a good resource as well. There's Cogbooks, who create adaptive learning systems that have been used at several institutions, where one of the biggest adopters of this has been the University of Central Florida. I'm sorry, no, Cogbooks has been adopted at many institutions, not at there. Realize It has been adopted at the University of Central Florida. And Smart Sparrow is another adaptive learning platform, which provides some really good resources. And Alex is provided through McGraw-Hill, and they have really good resources in math and chemistry and perhaps other areas, but most of what I've seen in terms of their use has been their math practice, their math adaptive learning systems, and their chemistry adaptive learning systems, both of which have been documented to provide fairly good results in terms of student learning. There was also a group that I chaired with SUNY, the Faculty Advisory Council on Teaching and Technology, that has a report that summarizes a lot of the research on adaptive and personalized learning systems. And the report is right here. This was in May 2020, before the pandemic really hit very hard. And most publishers have some form of adaptive learning software to a greater or lesser extent. And if you would like a copy of these slides, including all the links, you can just go to this URL, tinyurl.com/free text for SUNY. Although again, it would work for people who are not from SUNY as well. Okay, well, good luck. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at john.kane@oswego.edu.